What makes a show special or to stand out from the lot? One way to see it is by having a personal touch, when the art style or the script do not follow the trends of the time. It's when you watch something and it doesn't remind you of 100 other series. It's when you don't remember it as something that blurs with everything else and becomes really hard to recollect what was going on in it.
Think of the color swap they were using in the older Mortal Kombat games. It was just the same design with a different color. Knowing the character backdrops helps, but looking at them, they all mash together after a while, and you will most likely only care about Scorpion and Sub-Zero just because they were the first two.
There is a sequel to Dick Grayman. Very few people remember what was going on in the older series. It's because there is nothing special in it. It is rehashing plots and ideas from many other series without doing something different with them.
I mean, just look at all the school comedies. It feels like the only thing that differentiates one title from another is the sexual fetishes, or the boob sizes, or the hair colors. The only ones which you end up remembering are those which have the most cute designs or the weirdest backgrounds, and even there you end up mashing them all together as a studio style instead of the series style. All Kyoani shows look the same, all Shaft shows look the same. You recognize the studio, but you don't recognize the title.
At the same time, not many in the industry are willing to create shows that are too different from the norm. Whatever is not designed to appeal to the masses is not going to sell as much. The majority of consumers want easily digestible products that won't be hard to comprehend. This is also why fighting shonen copy the formula of Dragon Ball for 3 decades. Why do things differently when everybody's content and used to it? The reason demographics exist is because there is a set of elements each audience wants to see more of, and it helps the creators to know where to focus on. If they do not follow patterns, they don't target a certain demographic. The average viewer gets easily confused when the priorities of a show are not crystal clear from the get-go. Unorthodox presentation never gets a big following because it's not easily digestible. The easiest way to be digestible is to be about stuff they have seen 1,000 times and are very familiar with. Last season, for example, Boku no Hero Academia came out and there was nothing special about it. That still didn't stop it from being one of the most popular and well-sold titles. At the same time, it's not like an unorthodox approach does not work either, especially when it comes to Sakuga. As long as there is fluent animation or trippy visuals, it's going to sell simply with the energy of the creator.
What really damages all these shows is how they are mostly garnish than refinement. The distillation process was perfected after centuries of experimentation. But making drinks taste good is not enough to make people buy them, thus you also need a fancy bottle to lure people into buying them. The process of making the drink is the refining part. The process of making it desirable is the garnishing part. In the early stages of the medium, most of the focus was placed on refining their formulas. Take the mecha genre, for example. It began as a remote-controlled giant robot fighting other robots, and every year they were trying out new things in order to improve the concept. Hey, I know, let there be a pilot in the robot. And hey, let's make the robot be a combination of different ships. And hey, let's place more focus on the pilots, so the story will be more interesting. This process took about a decade, and then the classic mecha formula as we know it was perfected. Now, the thing here is that this is where the refinement ended. They didn't try to mess with the formula any further until 15 years later. In the meantime, they still needed to make more mecha anime every year, so what could they do to keep people interested into watching shows that would be about the exact same thing in all of them? And the answer to that is garnish. Making the mecha designs more and more elaborate so they will look cooler than the older ones, as well as easier to distinguish them from one another, and have differences in how the pilots think, or what is the origin of the bad guys. That made them look very different, even if they play out in the exact same way.
Akiyuki Shimbo is the most famous example. The Monogatari franchise would be just another possible harem without his head tilts. Of course, it's still an otaku pandering harem, it's just standing out from all other harems for its artistic overtones and weird puns. I am not into that, I just appreciate the fact that Shimbo is allowed to use his style than the usual cookie-cutter one.
There is so much effort placed on making most of them look sexy or cool, while characterization and script are nothing more than afterthoughts. Hell, we have reached to a point where people overthink something just because it looks nice, and they don't really think if it makes any sense. The aesthetics of a show are supposed to enhance what is already there in characters and story, not overlap them entirely. People don't call Great Teacher Onizuka a good show because it looks nice. In fact, it looks very cheap. People like it because a lot of focus was placed on characterization, with the whole badass style of the protagonist simply enhancing all that. People don't call Toradora one of the best romantic comedies because it has a school and it's tsundere, but because the writer dared to do stuff almost no other romantic romantic comedy attempted. There is a scene in Perfect Blue where people are filming a rape. This is not fan service, it's part of the themes and the plot. That beta male being constantly surrounded by boobs on a comic kill, that's fan service, it has nothing to do with the story, it exists to distract you from the plot and ridicule the themes. People die in gruesome ways in Hokuto no Ken in every episode. That is shock factor and rule of cool, alright, but it doesn't ruin the characterization because a lot of time is placed on getting to like the characters. They don't introduce them and kill them 10 minutes afterwards and expect you to give a shit. That is not what happens in Attack on Titan. People die by monsters with no personality or depth, and you don't even remember their names, much less care that they are dead. So keep that in mind every time you feel like jumping on the bandwagon of the latest overhyped harem that pretends it's an action survival. Garnishing is cool only in small doses. If it's nothing but that, then the whole show is passable.
Something often misunderstood is treating appearance as identity. If something is defined only by superficial elements such as head accessories or clothes, then it has no actual substance to it. When characters are categorized by personality type rather than a specific personality, then they are not really characters. They are bland archetypes many like because it's easy to self-insert, or to use their imagination for adding whatever personality they want in them. Identity is about ideals and a specific way of thinking. That is why Gundam Build Fighters has no similarities with the title it's supposed to be based on. It's a generic proxy battle series that sells on a name. There is also the case of personality disorder. Gatchaman Crowds has an identity that makes it stand out from everything else, but it has nothing to do with the original title. What is the point of calling it Gatchaman when it could have any other name and nobody would be able to tell the difference? Same thing with the various alternative universes of Gundam. They just slap the name on them without any care for identity. They just do it for money. Valrave the Liberator is a pile of shit that steals ideas from all over the place, but at least it has its own name. You can dislike it for 1,000 reasons, none of which will be its affiliation with a better franchise. As I always like to say, names don't excuse the content, it's the content which excuses the names. Some defend the sudden changes in style within a franchise as a breath of fresh air instead of getting more of the same, but a change for the sake of change is as damaging as a stagnation of ideas. If it doesn't come off in a way that feels like a natural progression, you are not spicing up something, you are mutating it beyond recognition. If you perpetuate a franchise to the point it reminds you nothing of the original, then you went too far. You might as well stop making more of it and instead begin a new franchise. Most anime channels focus on very specific elements. If I generalize the content of certain channels, then Digibro could be seen as focusing on moe aesthetics, chibi on feels, pedantic romantic on theme analysis, geekak on comedy, and me on script. Notice how none of us make a video about an anime if it doesn't have what we like talking about the most? Digibro does not make videos for shows he doesn't find cute, chibi for shows he doesn't find the feels, pedantic romantic for shows he can't analyze its themes, geekak for shows he can't joke about, and me for shows I find nothing to talk about the script. This has the effect of me having nothing to say about K-On!, whereas Digipro will be talking hours upon hours about it. Although on paper we should be able to talk about any show regardless of what it's about, the truth is we're not even gonna bother with it if we don't find something worthy of talking about based on what we like the most. That is what I call the starting element point. On one hand, it's something that limits the amount of series we could be making videos about since we can't value all aspects of a show evenly. On the other hand, it's what gives us an identity, something which I consider more important than whatever we talk about in the videos. There is no objectivity, we are all presenting something from the perspective we fancy the most. Of course, supporting your claims properly is equally as important, otherwise we would be excusing everything with personal entertainment instead of how well it holds up on its own. Even so, clarifying why we liked it or not should come first and then talk about the aspects we consider secondary and are not good enough to change our opinion of a series as a whole. It's not a perfect method, but it's what gives the reviewer or vlogger an identity. I am not saying a style can forever stay the same. You are gradually changing it as you age and experience more things, or you are trying to remain relevant towards a newer generation. The first thing I noticed about the second cartoon featuring the turtles is that it lacked the identity of the first. Part of what made the 80s version such a hit was how it was riding everything that was popular at the time. People were fascinated with Japanese culture, the market was flooded with Japanese electronic devices and video games. Furthermore, the 80s were all about pro-ecology, anti-war and science fiction, which were also themes in the series, since the turtles were a product of unnatural mutations and were trying to prevent the invasion of an army from another dimension. These things are present in the 00 version as well, but by then such things were not as popular anymore. Furthermore, this version didn't even have a steady motive, since it was constantly changing main villains and objectives. Funny enough, this was caused by the fact that it had an ongoing plot. Unlike the 80s version, which became episodic pretty fast, this one constantly changes stuff. The atmosphere and genres of every arc are completely different from one another. Variety is good only when there is some sort of uniformity, and there was no such thing in this version. It was gradually moving further away from the initial premise of Turtles versus the Shredder to things that were not as interesting or that well planned as it was in the beginning. And guess what? The same thing happened even in the 80s version, when it was no longer the 80s. When the 90s arrived, cartoons became far darker and action-heavy, and people lost interest in the goofy episodic adventures of the Turtles. In an attempt to increase viewership, the last 3 seasons in the mid-90s were also way darker and less funny, which had an opposite effect, since without properly fleshed out characters or much of a plot, it became duller than it already was. Not to mention pretentious for trying to be something it never was. Seriously, those last seasons are terrible. I make it sound like change is evil and there shouldn't be any plot at all, or nothing should ever change, but that is not what I mean. A show must have consistency and not try to last as much as it can. The 80s version should have ended in the 7th season, instead of trying to drag it on for 3 more seasons by mutating, oh the irony, into something that made it lose its motive. The same thing happened with the 00 version. Up to season 3, there was a logical progression of the main objective, but once the first Shredder was defeated for good, the writers were improvising thereafter and the results were so lazy. Hey, I know, let's have training sessions where the Turtles transform to dragons and fight a different Shredder, and then let's have them going to the future to fight a video game Shredder, none of which will have fleshed out characters or much of a plot. It was bullshit. To sum it up, I somewhat like both versions for different reasons. They still have a lot of flaws, with the one in this particular case being how they lose their charm when they lose their initial magic, a combo of motive and identity. One of the biggest challenges that forces someone to change is popularity. You can see that in many reviewers on YouTube, they mellow down as time goes by. The bigger your fan base becomes, the more careful you need to be in what you say or do, because the chances of pissing off someone and flagging your content increase as time goes by. Also, the more people follow you, the more money you make out of them, so you have to pander them in order to stick around instead of telling them what you really think. This is why it gets progressively harder to be yourself, or at least the person you began as, the more popular you become. And then there are some who jump the shark and end up having too much identity because they refused to change. And by change, I mean grow up. It's funny when you're a 12-year-old who yells, "Omiji Naruto is the best!" It's pure cringe when you do the same when you're 25. And half naked, and pretend to shoot at the screen. This is not a good image, unless you're a clown. Double for Anime is not a clown, he's just clowning around. And let's be completely honest here, most of you also care mostly about one specific aspect of any series, which is also why you're following specific channels focusing on it. You don't seek objectivity as much as listening to someone saying what you want to hear. So don't give me excuses about being narrow-minded if you have a starting element point. If you try to be as neutral as possible, you become Arcada, a sellout relativist who doesn't really say anything.